Welcome back to the second half of Our City, where I'm pleased to be joined by Ms. Krishna Garlick, who is the president of the Elizabeth Branch NAACP. Welcome, Krishna.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How about you?
Great, thank you.
Good.
February is Black History Month.
It is.
And as the president of the NAACP, please explain to us the significance of the month.
Well, it's an annual celebration that really takes an opportunity for African Americans to educate the general public about contributions of Black Americans to the community, to the development of America. And it's an opportunity for us to recognize significant achievements in our community and, what contributions we've made to society.
Now, it didn't just start last month, last year, whatever.
No.
How do we come to start celebrating this month?
So Carter G. Woodson was the first founder of what was Black History Week in 1926. And so for some time, we really only celebrated a week in February. And eventually there was an expansion into a month.
And I don't know if you know that, but how do we go from a week to a month?
It was actually students in Ohio at Kent University who first came up with the idea of really wanting to make the expansion into a whole month of celebration. And that was in, I have to look at my notes, 1969 that they originally proposed that. But it wasn't until the 1970s when it became officially recognized in the United States as a celebration of a month-long celebration.
Now, I remember as a child growing up, it wasn't part of the curriculum in the school system. So how did you obtain all this knowledge?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not a part of general education or, core studies that happen in. I mean, we know from growing up, you and I both in Elizabeth, that's been a battle a long time of trying to make sure that becomes a part of the curriculum throughout the city. But I think for me and for a lot of people in the city that our education came through, first and foremost, our parents, right? So, for many of us, our parents were a part of the civil rights movement, participated firsthand, can, tell you stories about, what it was like growing up in, the abusive South or, being a part of, changes that happened here locally. And so for me, a lot of my knowledge came from my parents, my mother and father, who made sure that I got exposed to really understanding my history. And then, my father was was the executive director of the Eport Presbyterian Center, which has been around for over 60 years. And they were definitely a huge proponent of Black history and understanding your history and really making sure that we knew that our history started before slavery. But understanding the significance of slavery and the civil rights movement. I know in particular for my family, my last name is Garlick. So when people say that they have their slave name, I know for a fact that that's true for my family. My parents made sure that we had an opportunity to go back and actually visit the plantation where my family was owned, my ancestors was owned. So the Garlick plantation is in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. And so we've actually been there and seen our ancestors buried there and really got, a firsthand experience with, the plantation where, we were owned.
So you were fortunate with the Eport Press and all the good works they did. For me, my mother worked in the library, so I was forced to go there and sit and read and read and read. And at the time, I was fighting, kicking back. I didn't want to, but now I appreciate those moments. And you learn so much, especially with book reports. I had to make sure they were neat and done. And I was like, Mom, why? But now it comes back and I say, thank you.
So the library now, the Elizabeth Public Library, is still a huge source for education and has been historically a huge source for education around Black history and, a number of other months that are celebrated around people's diversity. And I think, our library director, Mary Faith Kimmel, has been doing a great job in really making sure that she recognizes the diversity in the city. And I know that for this month of February 2016 that there are a number of Black history programs that are scheduled to happen there.
Now, as you mentioned the Eport, and I know the civil rights movement, as a child at first I thought it was strictly in the South.
Right.
But Elizabeth had its own struggles during the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. So I know, again, through my conversations with my father and people like Steve Sampson and, people who have had long histories around really trying to face racial injustice here in the city, that in around the same time that the civil rights movement was happening, that we did have some riots here as well when the riots were happening around the country, that they were not as significant or not as, I guess, violent, but definitely it was disruptive enough to point to the fact that there was a problem, and that Black people were definitely feeling like they were being neglected and treated unfairly in the city.
Right.
During the late 60s, we had a huge protest with the Black community against the police department. My father definitely tells stories, and my mother, about being beaten by the police, having to take shelter when, the protest was happening, and really standing up against the police brutality that was taking place during that time period. I mean, obviously that was under a different leadership. We then had Mayor Dunn was in office, and obviously a different police director. And so a really different time, it was at a time where we really didn't have the Black police officers represented on the force. But I think it was, kind of symbolic of what was happening across the country. Right. And we were able to see that, or use that as a catalyst for change in the city of Elizabeth. I mean, there were a lot of huge developments that happened as a result of that. There were organizations that then bloomed out of that. Right. I think there was one that was called American Friends Services Society. That was, I think, run by Ray Bailey is the name. And so he was here for a number of years and really pushed around, conversations around racial injustice. Steve Sampson would have meetings in his barbershop, right, to really get people talking about, And
I remember as a child going to this barbershop, he had a little voting machine there.
Right.
And he would teach people how to vote.
Right. Right.
So it was a wealth of knowledge going on in his barbershop. So
absolutely.
I hats off to those who fought to get that name on the building.
Right.
Now, do you have the opportunity to share what you know with the younger generation now, and especially within your household?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there are opportunities. I mean, we have the Youth NAACP, which, we kind of do similar things to what you talked about with your mom, like pushing them to go to the library and read books, making sure that we're going to a number of educational programs. I think unfortunately parents are not as active in educating their kids about history. But I think that's because we have so much more that we're juggling, now. At the same time, we're teaching our kids about, the public health issues in Flint, Michigan, with the lead in the water, right? And, helping them to understand that when they hear it on the news, and the bombings that are happening, and, ISIS. And so there's so many things that you're trying to make sure you talk to your children about, that, having to make sure that you're conscious of talking about, diversity and ancestry, is just another thing that's on the list. But I think there are opportunities, and it's important that we continue to do it.
And before we wrap today, I just want to ask you, you started off talking about the importance of African History Month. Now, recently someone came out publicly and said they feel differently about you, Miss Dash.
Right.
What do you think about her statement?
I think it's sad, right? I think she's the reason why we need to be reminded. She's the reason why we need to celebrate Black History Month. She and others, and I'm sure she's not the only person, and she was just bold enough to say what she felt. But people do want to believe that we're all one, and, we don't need to make a distinction. But I think that's not reality. Reality is that we should respect each other for, our differences, and embrace that. And I want you to celebrate, the beauty of my skin color, because it is beautiful, and I do embrace it, and I don't want to not be, a beautiful African American woman. Like, it's okay that that's who I am. So I think it's unfortunate that she, struggles with that, and struggles with her identity, and has forgotten the sacrifices of her ancestors that helped her to become, the person that she is.
Right. Well, I enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you.
And you inspired me to go to the library today.
Me or your mom.
Thank you for joining in for this segment of Our City, and we'll want you to have a great and wonderful week. Thank you.